Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, The Times They Are A-Changing. I'm Trent Taylor with McGuireWoods in the Richmond office, and wanted to, first of all, welcome everyone for attending. We're very excited about our program today. As some of you probably know, we do sort of quarterly webinars about labeling. But with all the changes that's taking place in our government and with our courts, we thought it made sense to do a broader webinar about how all of these changes might affect the food and beverage industry. So that's what we're going to do today. I wanted to first of all introduce briefly our panel, and it really is an all-star panel that we have here today, except for that Trent Taylor guy. And you may recognize a few of these names from our other webinars, but we brought in some other folks today. The folks who you probably recognize, we have Jenny Price and Ben Abel, who will be talking about labeling and litigation. You have Ross Dubonnet, who typically, out of our Chicago office, who typically does regulatory for our webinars, and he will be joined by Kate Hardy today, who is a partner and works closely with Royce and does a lot of regulatory work as well. And then also wanted to welcome two other members to this webinar. We have Brad Austin, who is the chair of the food and beverage industry team here at McGuireWoods, and he's going to talk about corporate and deals today. And then we also have Ryan Bernstein from our consulting group. And he has particular expertise into the legislative agenda for the new administration and new Congress, and that's what he'll be talking about today. So we're very excited. And I'll be talking about the Supreme Court. Here is sort of a roadmap of what we're going to try to accomplish today. There's obviously a lot of ground to cover. One thing I will note up front is as we go through this, if you have questions, don't be shy. There's a Q&A button on this platform where you can submit a question, and we will do our best to answer any questions you submit during the program. And if we can't get to all of them, then we will certainly contact you with our answer later. So feel free to utilize that, and we encourage it. A couple of quick advertisements that I wanted to know. Here at McGuireWoods, we have a labeling hotline as well as a monthly newsletter. And you know, this is something that we love talking about, all of these things in the food and beverage industry. So if you ever have a question or just want to talk with us about it, feel free to contact any of us because we love talking about it. Two other webinars that will be coming down the pipeline soon that I wanted to alert you to. One is a class action webinar that our class action team will be doing next week called Is There a Vaccine for Class Actions Too? And so that will be very informative and sort of answer some and get into some of the Supreme Court issues that I'll be talking about today will also be covered to a greater extent in that class action webinar next week. And then we also have our quarterly food and product labeling, litigation, and regulatory update that will be coming soon in late February, our Valentine's Day edition. So be on the lookout for an email about that if you have any interest. Okay, so what I'm going to do here for just a minute or two is just sort of set the table about what we're going to be talking about today. Obviously, we're at a very pivotal time right now with our government. It doesn't come around very often where, you know, not only do we have a new administration, but we also, Senate control has just passed from Senator McConnell to Senator Schumer. And, you know, so we have both the executive and legislative branches controlled by the Democrats for the first time in a while. And then on top of that, we have a new makeup on the Supreme Court. And of course, it's everyone sort of knows that with the addition of Judge Barrett, by most accounts, this is one of the most conservative Supreme Courts that we've had in a really long time. And that makes for a very, very interesting dynamic between the three branches of government, with the Democrats controlling two of them, but the Supreme Court being very conservative. And this dynamic is going to play out over not just the next 4 years, but quite possibly the next 40 years. And all of that, of course, leads to, what does all that mean? It means change. And that's what we're here to talk about today. What do we expect those changes to be? And to put a finer point on it, do we anticipate a regulatory or enforcement storm as a result of these changes in the government? And if so, in what areas? And will the courts, particularly this U.S. Supreme Court, step in to blunt the force of any new regulatory or enforcement mechanisms that are put in place by either the new Congress or the new Biden administration? That's going to be our focus today, and that's what we're going to talk about. So with that, let's get to it. I will pass it over now to Ryan.
Trent, thanks so much. Thanks for having me here, and it's a pleasure to visit with everybody about food and beverages and what we're looking for in the next Congress. Is going to be my kind of update. And, Trent mentioned it, and we all know, but who's in charge? It is obviously the Democrats. But the real kind of question is, what kind of mandate do they have, and how will they wield that mandate, especially as it relates to food and beverage industry? Now, I think it's pretty safe to say, I think the Biden administration itself is going to have a fairly large mandate to really do some significant work in the food and beverage area. We're going to see a lot of that come through executive orders that we've already been seeing, and we're going to see a lot of work done through their agencies and departments. We'll see the Department of Labor, FTC, EPA, all be very engaged in this. But for my money, what we're going to be looking at is the FDA and USDA. These two agencies are going to be under a lot of pressure from basically the administration and from those that put the administration and gave the majority to the House and the Senate to the Democrats to do basically kind of progressive issues on food and beverages and nutrition and agriculture in general. So I think we're going to see a pendulum swing from where FDA and USDA has been under the Trump administration to the new Biden administration. So we'll really watch, and I think we'll see some significant developments out of those two agencies. I mentioned here the House of Representatives, of course, in the Democratic hands. It is closer than it has been in years past. So in some issues, they might have a little trickier time coming up and having an agenda that's unified. But I don't think that's going to be the case when it comes to agriculture, food, and nutrition. They are generally well aligned, especially on the Democratic side, about how they approach this issue. So even though we're now closer than we have been in the past, 221 Dems to 211 Republicans, I can really see this being an implementing body for the Biden administration, for their agenda to move forward with legislation that is really going to be pretty significant in the 117th Congress. So with that, everything, of course, moves over to the Senate. I think that's how it's going to go, House to the Senate generally. And Senate is generally, traditionally, where things slow down, especially this year where it's going to be extremely tricky. As you know, we have a split 50-50 in the Senate with the Vice President being the tiebreaker. They are just working through the power sharing agreement, drop the filibuster request, saying that, we're going to cement that in stone and have it throughout this Congress. McConnell kind of dropped that now that we have a couple of senators saying that they will not change the filibuster. So we likely will need 60 votes for any individual legislation moving forward. So that is going to cool the temperature a little bit on some major legislative agenda items. But the one thing that everybody's going to be talking about in Washington, D.C. is the Budget Reconciliation Act. So we got to watch for this in a couple of different areas. This has been used every once in a while for big legislative items to get around the filibuster rule. And it looks like Congress may go back and pick this up if they're not seeing traction very soon on some items. Of course, this was used during the tax cut process under the Trump administration, and it was used for the health care bill back under the Obama administration. And that's where I think we got to really watch to see what can come in on this, whether or not it's taxation or health care. Those are the areas that I think really could be impacted and pull in food, beverage, and regulations that we need to watch very carefully. Just a short primer on budget instructions and the reconciliation process. Basically, Bernie Sanders has the gavel right now of the Budget Committee. They will draw up instructions to the relevant committees to say, hey, we need you to adjust federal spending, debt, and deficit by X amount. Go and implement legislation that matches that. So then each committee then will be tasked with trying to come up with taxes, regulations, et cetera, that kind of fit with those mandates. They'll come back and that'll be voted on, and that's a straight up majority vote. So there are some rules to that. There's Senator Byrd put some stuff in play back in the 80s and 90s that basically has the Byrd rule that things can't be incidental. It goes through what they call a Byrd bath to make sure that it's relevant to the federal debt and deficit, but there's definitely taxation and healthcare issues that really could be relevant to the reconciliation process. So that will be something that we all need to watch as Congress moves forward. So really, who's kind of in charge at the committee level? Who are the relevant players? And this is very significant because this Congress is really different as far as leadership than the prior Congresses. I pulled out a few committees that are very relevant to this conversation. And looking through them, the Committee on Energy and Commerce in the House, that, for our purposes oversees FDA, the only person that's still basically a holdover is the chairman, Frank Pallone, Democrat from New Jersey. You're going to see a lot of changes in leadership on the rest of the committee. So it's going to be a lot of fresh ideas and initiatives that other members have wanted to push forward, going to really kind of bubble up to the top. Kathy McMorris Rogers from Wisconsin is going to be the new ranking member on Energy and Commerce. And, I'd say pretty big changes at the Agriculture Committee, Authorizing Committee in the House. Colin Peterson, longtime Blue Dog Democrat, very moderate, lost his reelection. So David Scott from Georgia is going to step up, take that gavel. A fairly moderate individual. G.T. Thompson, Pennsylvania, also a fairly, I'd say, moderate Republican. So they could have a very good working relationship there at the Agriculture Committee. The thing that's really interesting in the House, in my perspective, is the Agriculture and FDA Appropriations Committee, and basically the Appropriations Committee generally. Outside of the reconciliation process, a lot of look for rules, regulations, money, things like that being implemented through the appropriations process, because that is going to likely happen every year, and that's some of the legislation that always makes its way through. One of the big developments was Rosa DeLauro taking over as chairwoman of the whole appropriations. Now, I say that because she has had a keen interest in food and agriculture production in her years in Congress. She's a very kind of eccentric congresswoman. You'll see her, she has bright hair, sometimes purple, sometimes it's pink, but she's very sharp and dialed in on nutrition issues and agricultural production. She really wants to reform the USDA. I had a conversation with her just before the election, and she said, this is going to be one of my top priorities, no matter what committee I'm on. We're going to reform the USDA, and we're going to look at nutrition, and we're going to look at how our food is produced in this country. So she's kind of got that overall agenda. The new chair for the committee for the actual agriculture and FDA approps is Sanford Bishop, and the ranking member is Fortenberry from Nebraska. New members, but going to be maybe more moderate, but watch for DeLauro really to help drive some of that agenda on agriculture and FDA appropriations. Now, who's in charge in the Senate? Basically, as you know, would be all new because of the chamber's now flipped control. But a couple of members really want to highlight. Patty Murray from Washington is now going to be the chair of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee, the authorizing committee with FDA. And she's also going to be chair of the Labor, likely the chair of the Labor HS Appropriations Committee, too. So she really hasn't played in this space, I would say, a ton in the past, but she will be a very key member moving forward. Now, what could be very interesting and I think really supplement what Secretary Vilsack will do at USDA will be the Senate Agriculture Committee with the new chairwoman, Debbie Stabenow. Stabenow is a very strong member that has very strong views on nutrition and how large-scale agriculture really plays into our food production in this country. She's very press-friendly. She likes the press, and she's going to gear up now to help implement what the USDA wants to move, and she's going to gear up for the Farm Bill, which she's going to start working on towards the end of this year. So we could really see her be a significant player now. John Bozeman, Republican from Arkansas, he's kind of more of a traditional agriculturalist. He's a little bit more reserved in the press. So it'll be interesting to see how Bozeman and Stabenow play at the Agriculture Committee, but it's going to be a significant committee given what USDA wants to implement moving forward. The other side to the House Appropriations Committee is the Senate Agriculture and FDA Appropriations. These positions haven't been filled yet, but there's a very good chance Jeff Merkley, who was the ranking in the past, will now become chair. And there can be a little bit of a round robin in the Senate side with Lamar Alexander retiring. Some people may want to move up to take his old position at Energy and Water. John Hoeven was chairman of the Agriculture and FDA Appropriations Committee last Congress. He was my former boss. I was his chief of staff. And while nothing has been official, they're still working through the process. If I had to put money on anything, I'd put money on Hoeven staying at Agriculture FDA Appropriations. And as we mentioned, the appropriations for Labor H, that will also be very intriguing to see who takes on the ranking member position. There's a good chance Roy Blunt will stay there, but we will see. We're following that very closely. The one other committee I didn't mention was the Finance. Of course, Wyden's taking that over, and Crapel will be the ranking. They deal with health policy and taxation, so we'll definitely watch that very closely. So, what are the initiatives in Congress? Well, everybody knows COVID is going to be the large initiative for the Biden administration, for Congress coming out of the gates. It's going to take up a lot of oxygen, and we'll see if they can come up with a bipartisan plan, but as we mentioned, it may be moving down the reconciliation process. So if that happens, the next thing they kind of want to talk about is infrastructure, maybe a climate bill, maybe that has to go through reconciliation too. We'll see inequality issues, say like voting, police reform. So that's really going to take up a lot of the first part of Congress. There was going to be a lot of talk about nullifying midnight regulations. You saw what the administration did in freezing a lot of the regulations that were put in place right at the end or in the process when they got in by an executive order. Congress had planned on maybe working through a Congressional Review Act where they formally nullify a lot of the regulations that were done, say about 60 days or so before the end of Congress. That's slipping down on the priority list because there's so many other things that have to get done. So thinking that there was going to be a lot of pushback on some regulations is probably going to be less likely now in Congress. It will have to be handled as much as they can through executive order. So that is significant, and Royce and Kay will talk about this more down the road. But with rules like hemp and CBD, that will affect those types of rules. Now, is there any time left for a food and beverage regulations agenda in Congress? I would say absolutely yes. We'll see, as I mentioned, a lot up front with regulations, but I think Congress will start working on this now, and we may start seeing some stuff in the pipeline and kind of come out towards the end of this year and definitely next year working through their agenda. So there will be time for this, and it might get tied up in some budget reconciliation issues. Now, what are those issues? What is Congress going to look at? And there's a host of issues. But I would summarize, what Congress is looking at is basically the consumer protection and transparency angle on food and beverage. This is going to be the mantra in Congress. And I think the food and beverage industry generally is going to be fairly ready for this. Now, ready for the topics, but the implementation and the language, that's all going to be very trying. We're going to, I think, see kind of a pullback from basically the Obama-Biden years where the food and nutrition was really kind of run out of the First Lady's office with a lot of her initiatives. She was successful in a lot of that. But I think this time under a Biden administration, you're going to see the full weight of the full administration. USDA, FDA really put behind their effort on trying to come up and work on consumer protection and transparency. What does that mean? I think you're going to see largely kind of two things. Labeling and traceability is one of the things that I think we'll see up front. A lot of discussion about how are consumers going to receive the information about the products that they are consuming or using. It's going to be on-pack labeling, upfront labeling. How are you going to work in, the technology, digital disclosures? How do you use your phones to figure out what is in the product? You're going to see a lot of that information being discussed. That's going to be pretty controversial. One of the things that may not be controversial up front is traceability, but I think there's going to be a lot of controversy on the backside of this. USDA and the FDA has been working pretty extensively on this over the last couple of years. There's been bipartisan support on the issue of traceability, basically with the FDA implementing the Food Safety Modernization Act, the blueprint for the new era of smarter food safety, and frankly, Congress has put a lot of money behind tracing and traceability and technology and tracing. Just the last budget, Congress put in a little over $17.5 million to the FDA just for technology and food safety initiatives. That ranges from, anything from seafood imports to safety to $5 million with cannabis and derivatives, regulations, cosmetics, things like that. So Congress is putting money behind that, and I could see that continuing to move forward. Now, it's going to move beyond your typical monitoring and E. coli tracing. I think you're going to see a lot more about tracing as far as sustainability, climate, knowing where your food is produced, what size of, is it a local market, how does it move? A lot of that social issues could really kind of even come into the traceability. So beyond that, look for taxes, advertising, truth of advertising, all that will be out there. A lot on the generally acceptable as safe, that could be used on both sides for basically looking at readdressing caffeine, sodiums, but also maybe the push on hemp and other things in CBD. We'll see definitely work on SNAP as more money goes out. How will that be used? And we'll talk more about this in this seminar, but how do you regulate new technologies, gene editing, CRISPR, cell-based meats? I can tell you when I was in the Senate, the FDA was pushing so hard to stay in that game, and I think that they will have a bigger voice as they move forward in this Congress. So climate, diet, all that's going to be part of the discussion. And one of the really big things is we're going to watch is how then do the states play in this? There's going to be a lot done in Congress, but this Congress could really allow states like California, Prop 65, and others to really lead and push the envelope on food and nutrition regulations. So a lot on the agenda. We may not see a lot tomorrow, but I think we'll definitely be seeing a lot of action both in the administration and Congress on this issue moving forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brad.
And this is Trent, real quick. Before you leave us, Ryan, I just had one quick question for you. Is there one or two takeaways that you want to leave our audience with?
Yeah, what I would do is, watch both how the FDA, USDA, and Congress all coordinate this, especially through the House and through the Senate Agriculture and Appropriations Committee. We're going to see a big push on that, all wrapped into climate, social justice, inequality. That's going to be the new mantra. So don't think that if you don't see it today, you won't see it in a few months towards the end of the year. It's going to happen.
All right. Thanks a lot, Ryan. We'll pass it over to Brad now.
All right. Thank you, Trent. And Ryan, thanks for your thoughts there. As Trent mentioned, I'm in the Charlotte office, and one of the things that I do here at the firm is lead the food and beverage team. And one of the best parts about that job is just getting to work with really awesome teammates like this. I always learn something. So appreciate everybody joining us for this discussion. So I am a corporate lawyer, do M&A work, and I always like to look at charts and graphs. So I wanted to take us back a little bit, and Trent set the stage for the presentation, and I wanted to talk a little bit about looking back to set the stage for what does the corporate deal world look like. So this is a pretty standard graph. It's kind of interesting if you think about February of 2020 last year. You would have probably expected that column on the far right to be a little higher, but perhaps in March of 2020 you would have expected that column to be really, really low. I think everybody would have probably taken that in March. So M&A was strong in the second half of 2020, and that's really what got us to that number. Lots of deals in a pandemic, quite remarkable. Perhaps even more interesting is when you look at the valuations and you look at pricing. You go back 10 years, multiples are the highest that they've ever been. It's a really interesting data point. Why do we think that is? I think there's a couple of things. We've heard people say some sellers just wanted out. It was a good time to sell. There were private equity funds that had to deploy capital. So perhaps that's another reason. Consider, though, the monetary policy, and to tie it back into the theme of this presentation, I'm going to give you a preview of something we'll talk about here coming up. Here's some comments from Jay Powell. Keeping rates at low levels. The central bank likely will not be in any hurry to raise interest rates. Takeaway is that money was really cheap and credit was available. Now, it is true that I think some of the leverage multiples were down a little bit, but I believe they've come back, and that really supported that valuation. If you break the valuation multiples down by sector, these are just a few that I picked up from any number of investment banks. Protein was 20 times. Restaurants were about 12.5. Fruits and vegetables were 8 times. So some really strong numbers. What about public companies? Kind of stuck with PE deals. I do a lot of restaurant transactions, so I usually kind of default to restaurant numbers. So I pulled this from a monthly report. I think some of this is easy to make some sense of, but it also shows you just sort of the wide range of what restaurants have gone through. Chipotle, obviously, off-premise, but their food is not necessarily easily transportable like maybe a Wingstop or a Domino's Pizza. Wingstop, that's a chain with a small footprint. Domino's, you've probably read a lot about their technology, their delivery technology. The next three, Denny's, Cracker Barrel, Dave & Buster's, casual dining, no real surprise there. Not a lot of off-premise, not transportable. And then you have Brinker at the bottom, which I included just to put some question marks in there. It's like, why is that one so high? Brinker's Chili's, for those of you who aren't familiar with it. And from what I've read and can discern, it's due to their digital platform. That's a key theme, I think, going forward. That innovation, that technology investment has really been something that you've heard a lot of private equity funds talk about, and it has enabled a lot of these companies, restaurants in particular, to pivot and to adapt. So that looks backwards. Let's take it forwards now and kind of talk about what are we dealing with for M&A transactions. So I'll go back to the slide from Jerome Powell. My biggest takeaways from these comments, and these are not necessarily scientific, I just did some basic internet searching. The former Fed colleagues have a history of working well together. Their shared experience sets the stage for the closest working relationship between their institutions. We're talking about Janet Yellen and Jerome Powell here. So I think you're going to see a continued availability of money, of capital. If you look to the Treasury, we knew stimulus was going to come, and that's again, these are just some basic comments that I've pulled. We knew that there would be a push for some extended jobless benefits. Perhaps the biggest takeaway is the $15 an hour, the minimum wage. And if you've been paying attention, even this morning, I saw a headline about the Democrats in the House presenting a proposal for raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour over the next 5 years. That's definitely going to be something that will get priced into transactions. How is that going to work? How is a buyer going to account for that? Will that put a pressure on labor? And we can talk about that in a few more details here after a couple more slides. All right, what other headlines are noteworthy for deals? We talked about the really number 2 and 3 already there, the minimum wage. The top one is kind of interesting. There was a 2-year period added for 100% deductibility, of business meals. That could be a real benefit to restaurants. Still have the issue of getting people out and traveling, but to the extent that people do that, maybe that will benefit restaurants. So definitely something to pay attention to. My last 2 points here really piggyback on something Ryan said earlier. I do believe that states will lead the way on a lot of the measures. Food safety, whether it's ingredients or whether it's packaging. Packaging will continue to be a big thing to pay attention to as more and more off-premise becomes more regular. There is certainly pent-up demand for people to return to dining rooms and to eat, but there will always be a higher level of off-premise / delivery than maybe we had seen pre-pandemic. How do those costs translate into M&A deals? Something that buyers are going to have to factor in. I did not include a point for this, but I also think data privacy, given the push for digital, will be an area of focus for buyers. It's a hot topic, and people will have to continue to think about their safeguards and protections for that. Okay, so maybe we can look forward, and these are just some thoughts that I put down on what are buyers going to pay attention to. We'll highlight a few of them in depth, and we can start with labor. So we talked about the minimum wage and how that will factor into deals. Another thing to think about is what will the labor market look like? Where will these companies find labor? Can I add, if I buy target X, can I add another shift so I can ramp up production if I'm a buyer? And right now that might be difficult, but one of the things that I always enjoy doing is just reading some of the economic analysis from any number of banks and other places. Here's one from Wells Fargo. So if you look at figure 5, it indicates the immigration rate. But if you go to sort of the middle of that paragraph, one way to boost production would be to increase the labor supply. And you do that through changes in immigration policies. So if I'm a buyer and there's a labor shortage, but I know that there's immigration changes, is that something that's going to help me? Is that going to be a short-term thing or a long-term thing? Lots would have to happen, probably, maybe perhaps even in order to get there, but definitely something to pay attention to. We'll hit food costs here in a second, but to get back to packaging, like I mentioned, the ESG investing is going to be a big deal, and state regulation that I talked about. With respect to food costs, here's another slide that I think is pretty interesting. If you like graphs like me, you just go pull stuff and try to look at it and see what you can learn. So these are some random commodities that I pulled, but fairly consistently you see a pricing increase. And that's a 12-month time period. If you look over the last 3 to 5 months, it's basically just gone up. How does that translate to production? How does that translate to pricing? How does that translate to what consumers end up paying? We will continue to monitor that on our side. I know buyers will most likely factor that into their valuation numbers on their deals. Okay, I'm going to work through the rest of this slide here, and then we'll finish up with opportunities. Digital will continue to be something that will drive a lot of business for restaurants. I've talked to several consultants who say people do not want to order from a live person anymore. They want to order on their phone. They think that it's safer. They think that it's quicker. So pay attention to if you do go out to eat, are you ordering from a person? Another digital application is, do you scan a QR code when you sit down at a table to pull up the menu? Are there paper menus anymore? Will the menus go away? Lots of emphasis on digital transformation in both restaurants and manufacturers. Real estate, we've all heard about real estate. I don't see that necessarily being something that buyers are going to pay a lot of attention to for manufacturing and production. However, on the restaurant side, I would expect a large emphasis on, do we need this space? Do we really need a dining room? Can we just have a ghost kitchen? Sort of following maybe the Wingstop or a pizza delivery. And we just have a footprint with a kitchen, and it's basically a cabinet where folks come in and pick up their order, pick up their food. Moving into deals, valuations should continue to be high. One of the things that I read recently was arguing about the valuations and debt levels has been futile over the past few years, primarily because the Fed and monetary policy have just supported it. So as high as those valuation and multiple numbers were, I would expect those to continue. The pace of those deals, second half of this year should be pretty brisk. Right now, we're probably in a little bit of everyone digesting the acquisitions that they did in 2020. I expect it will pick up just as a vaccine gets further and further out there, more distributions of that will only help drive these M&A deals. Debt levels, they should probably stay around the same. I hesitate to predict anything there. I haven't seen enough data to argue one way or the other. All that I've seen is that they were around the same as they have been. So that, again, is a good thing for deal guys like me. On the risk point, I'm seeing more and more folks use insurance as a tool. That could be regular P&L insurance, but a lot of times in transactions, that's transaction-specific insurance, whether it's representations of warranties, tax liability insurance, specific litigation. The products are out there, and sophisticated buyers are using them to get to the closing table and to ward off this risk. What other opportunities might be out there for deals? These are just a few headlines that I pulled. The first one is meant to illustrate ingredients. There will be probably more and more focus on the types of ingredients. You heard Ryan talk about the makeup of a lot of the committees, some of the focus on nutrition. I expect that to be something that private equity funds in particular will focus on. Nutraceuticals, plant-based, etc. You see plant-based on there. Second point, variety, simplification. If you have gone to a restaurant, you've probably noticed that the menu is simpler. If you've been to the grocery store, probably noticed that there's not 12 different varieties of XYZ products. There may only be 5. Some of that was due to supply chain issues. Some of it was due to consumer demand. Last point to think about for deal drivers, research and development. Where will the innovation come from to meet that consumer demand? For the past 5-10 years, R&D has been outsourced through M&A transactions. We expect that to continue. So the takeaways from the corporate M&A world are last year was a strong M&A year, and we expect that to continue this year. I do not think the Biden administration is likely to do much out of the gate that is going to change that outlook. However, keep a watch on tax rates. As Ryan mentioned earlier, there's always an aversion to taxes when it comes to M&A transactions, and that will be something that folks continue to talk about. Trent, I think that wraps it up for the corporate outlook.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot, Brad. I think you've already answered the question about the takeaway, so I appreciate it. With that, I think we're going to turn it over to Kate and Royce.
Yeah, thanks, Trent, and thanks, Brad, for that in-depth review. My name is Royce Dunay. I'm an associate that focuses mostly on food and drug regulation at the firm in our Chicago office, and I'm joined by Kate Hardy, who is a partner in our Charlotte office. And, we're really focusing right now on a couple of things in our deck here. It's going to be on where USDA has landed with the final rule and where we see FDA going under the Biden administration, and finally with some good old standard labeling updates from our friends at FDA that got out the door in between our last presentation and this one. So where are we on hemp? We're finally at a final rule for hemp from USDA, which came out January 15th, 2021, and not much has really changed there. It's allowed for some questions to be answered, such as, what do I do if I have a hot crop? Do I need a DEA lab to test my hemp plant? Export is still not addressed, and where do I need to consider what DEA and USDA have resolved? So if you remember a while back, we were operating under kind of an interim final rule with hemp, and it gave us some good guidelines on where to go, how to resolve issues such as, oh no, my farmer that I'm utilizing for some of my products accidentally grew a hot crop, which is a crop that's testing above 0.3% THC on a dry net basis. And, is that a criminal violation? Well, USDA says in this new rule it's not. It's probably negligent if it's below, if the crop is testing at 0.5% to 1%. And you're only allowed one negligent violation a year if you're a farmer. Any more than that, you could get reported from a criminal standpoint. And do I need DEA to come out? Do I need agents to come out to the field and take my crop and dispose of it if it's a hot crop? No, USDA has answered firmly in the final rule that you can just bury that crop in the ground if it's done in accordance with an approved destruction method. Export is still not addressed, as I said. Labs, most of the laboratories out there, especially in states like Illinois or other states that are coming on board, are not DEA registered labs yet. So USDA has given a grace period for about another year or two to come online and eventually get those labs up and running. But really, what does this mean for food companies? It's really a lot of these regulations on the Farm Bill may seem as though they're addressed to farmers, but they really go a little bit further into overall compliance with the product that is being sourced. The finalized rule for the Farm Bill that USDA created gives a blueprint of what an internal compliance program should look like when sourcing CBD, what questions you should be asking from suppliers. If you're on the finance side, what questions you should be asking your banking or lending customers. It gives us a template for the entire CBD and hemp industry. Kate, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, thanks, Royce. I mean, you covered it really well. I mean, I think one nice thing from this final rule, which is a long read, is a lot of the comments that were submitted in response to the rule, I think, were taken into consideration. And there's definitely a little bit more flexibility with quite a few things that were obviously a little bit too maybe black and white and difficult to comply with, such as when crops are inspected, like you mentioned, the negligence threshold. So I think that's a good thing to see. And I think, of course, since this industry is continuing to develop, it does sound like, there's a willingness to try to evolve as well as we are, developing greater experience with products that are coming from hemp.
Yeah, the other important point on the slide before I go on to the next slide is we don't have clarity on where DEA stands with all of this. DEA, and I would not adjust a compliance program yet towards this, but DEA came out last year with a strange position about what's called in-process hemp, which is like, I've got a farm in southern Illinois, I've got my hemp factory outside of Chicago, I've got my extraction plant in the middle of the state. The hemp at that extraction plant, sometimes in enough concentration in a tank or other part of the process, might, for that step of the process, rise above 0.3% THC on a dry net basis. But the final product will not have it that high. The hemp that's grown in the field will not have it that high. USDA, as we see on the final rule, has laboratory threshold limits there. Your hemp in the lab has a margin of testing that, it could be like a 0.6% or something, whatever the variable in the lab test is. DEA came out with a position that is hinting at any time if it goes above 0.3% THC in the process, it could be in violation of the Controlled Substances Act. That view is, I don't think, shared by USDA based on the final rule, but USDA has not waded into the waters of the Controlled Substances Act because that's not their realm of enforcement or jurisdiction. It really remains to be seen if DEA just spoke out of turn on this, if it turns into some sort of enforcement policy at DEA, or if the new Department of Justice will decide to rein in DEA a bit there. We have not seen any enforcement based on DEA's position, and it's unlikely that that will become the norm, but just something to pay attention to. So, under Biden, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I think that's a great point. Just really to round out that slide is it's always important to remember that there's several agencies that are involved when we're thinking about hemp. So to your point, there's the DEA. But one also important thing in the final rule was USDA still very clearly said we are deferring to FDA with respect to everything under FDA's realm for dietary supplements, food, any other type of product. So there's a lot of different agencies that you always have to be thinking about when we're talking about hemp.
Yeah, absolutely, Kate. And, where are we right now with USDA selections under Biden, FDA selections? Tom Vilsack will be heading up USDA, veteran Beltway politician, longtime advocate of hemp, really not seeing too many waters being shaken at USDA in terms of hemp, level-headed, for the most part, politician, will likely carry out the same policies of USDA with respect to bioengineered and other nutritional initiatives that the agency has. Janet Woodcock is currently heading up FDA, has been at FDA since 1986, very deferential to the agency, a agency fixture, centerpiece. But Janet Woodcock's position is largely controlled by COVID-19 vaccine distribution and prioritizing emergency use drugs for COVID-19. Really, we're not going to see a lot, I would suspect, from her with respect to hemp or CBD, given where we are right now in the COVID-19 crisis. Another selection, it's thought that Biden may elevate her to be the head of the agency, remains to be seen. Another player to be head of FDA is Joshua Sharfstein, veteran of the agency, really believes in the agency's core mission, been in Washington a long time. The point that I'm trying to make here is that these are not people from industry. These are people that have been very much inside FDA, believe in FDA's enforcement abilities and positions to effectuate change through regulation. Not saying they're going to be hostile to industry, but they are people that are very intimately familiar with FDA's power and FDA's regulatory abilities. Neither are free to critique from outsiders. They do take a very deferential stance to FDA, as mentioned earlier, so it remains to be seen where they go once COVID-19 is over. Javier Becerra is going to be head of Health and Human Services as an AG in California, very deferential to cannabis. Reason I bring Health and Human Services up is because it's the parent agency at FDA. And, we also never, and Kate will talk more about this, we were expecting something from the Trump administration on CBD and enforcement. That time has come and passed. It never left the Office of Budget. And it remains to be seen if we're going to see some more input from FDA in the next year.
Yeah, unfortunately, that leaves a lot of folks who are really hoping for some additional guidance, particularly if they have on the market, still sort of wondering where things are going to land. It'll be just interesting to see, Biden obviously was part of the Obama administration. I know a lot of different folks have questioned whether or not some of the agenda that was forwarded during that administration, whether or not we'll go back to seeing some of those things come around again, whether it's stricter requirements for dietary supplements, going back and revisiting grass, et cetera. So I think a lot of it at this point is, like you said, we're still a little bit unknown, and we'll have to see how things start to play out as people fall a little bit more into place.
And the last part here is just, some guidance updates. FDA has finalized its position on potassium chloride. You can call it potassium salt. And we're going to see more, I think we're going to see in the next year, sesame being added to the list of allergens. Remains to be seen, but FDA released the guidance on voluntary disclosure. Of course, as everyone knows, it is required to be listed in Illinois. No enforcement I have seen yet for the state of Illinois on that. Illinois has other issues to worry about, but just something to keep in mind. And Kate, what do you think the two main takeaways are here?
Well, I think, Royce, one of the big ones, of course, since it's our favorite topic, is we'll really have to keep an eye on what is happening with hemp and CBD and those regulations, and whether or not we'll actually get a little bit more guidance in the future. And again, like we said, it involves a lot of different agency coordination from FDA to USDA to DEA. So there's a lot of pieces there. And then, obviously COVID is still a big topic, something we're trying to deal with. So we're going to probably see all these agencies focusing on those issues first, and hopefully we'll see more regulation when life gets back to normal, if we can get the COVID-19 a little bit more under control.
Completely agree. And turning over now to my colleagues, Jenny Price and Ben Abel.
Thanks, Royce. Good afternoon. Thank you guys for having us. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the recent labeling suits that were filed, and then talk about some potential trends under the new FDA, and then I'll turn it over to Ben to address some more specific food labeling claims. But this first case I wanted to flag for the group is a case that was recently filed against Anheuser-Busch in the Central District of California, where the plaintiffs allege that Anheuser-Busch failed to include language on the label indicating that their non-alcoholic beer, this Beck's beer, contains some amount of alcohol. And Anheuser-Busch filed a motion to dismiss very recently, I think it was just yesterday, stating that their label actually, in fact, expressly states that there is some alcohol. And I don't know if I tried to blow the beer bottle up a little bit, but it's not showing up super great on the PowerPoint, and I apologize for that. But you'll see directly under Beck's, it says non-alcoholic, and then sort of around the bottom horseshoe, if you will, of the label, it does state that there's less than 0.5% alcohol on the label. And so Anheuser-Busch, their position in the motion to dismiss is that the label is not misleading and it follows all federal requirements down to the letter and clearly indicates that the drinks do contain some amount of alcohol. So it will be very interesting. I marked this as one to watch to see how the Central District of California handles Anheuser-Busch's motion to dismiss. I'll be very curious since it does appear that their label complies. So we'll be watching that one, and we'll update you as we get a ruling from the Central District of California. The next case I wanted to flag on the labeling front is an essential oil class action that was filed in the Northern District of New York. I recently learned that the essential oil industry in the United States is actually estimated in 2020 to be about $5.2 billion in the U.S. So it is a large industry, and the claim that this plaintiff has filed against Young Living's essential oils are that they are not therapeutic as they claim in their labeling and marketing, and that their labeling and marketing is at issue with an NAD order in violation of the Federal Trade Commission Act, and in addition is also in violation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act because they've not been approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration regarding some of their claims, such as their essential oils have health benefits like reducing stress, relieving anxiety, helping with sleep, and treating symptoms of depression. This was recently filed on January 21st, so Young Living has not responded to the complaint yet, but this is one that we will definitely be watching as it unfolds in the Northern District of New York. So what can we expect under the new administration? And I think sometimes the future can be seen by looking to the past. I know we've talked a lot about trends and class actions in the labeling space on some of our webinars in the past, and so some of our repeat attendees will not be surprised to hear that hear me say this, but and it's not frankly a new trend, but the trend still exists out there that when the FDA sends either a warning letter or has some sort of enforcement action, that very quickly we often see class actions filed as a result of that sort of copycat what the warning letter from FDA is warning about. So an example of this would be when the FDA issued a warning letter to Gojo Industries, which is the maker of Purell. Weeks after that warning letter was issued, we saw class actions pop up in the Southern District of New York and California, alleging mislabeling regarding the effectiveness of Gojo's hand sanitizer Purell. We then, in the months following that, saw class actions filed against Germblock, Target, REI, and then in addition to hand sanitizers, we also found class actions that were filed against Clorox, Molecule Inc., which is an air purification unit, and Wet Ones. Just as an update on one of those class actions, the Clorox class action was about their splashless bleach label, where the plaintiff had alleged that the label was misleading because it leads consumers to think that the splashless bleach can disinfect surfaces just like regular Clorox, when in fact on the back of the label it said that it doesn't have the same disinfectant power as regular Clorox. That lawsuit was actually filed in the Northern District of California, and on January 22nd, the federal judge granted Clorox's motion to dismiss on that. Plaintiff will have leave to amend, but that is an update on that Clorox class action. So, what do we think will happen with the new FDA leadership? And as Royce and Kate explained, there's an interim head of FDA, Ms. Woodcock, and what we expect based off of the historic Democratic appointees is that we will see an increase in warning letters and enforcement actions from the new FDA leadership. That's just a prediction. Obviously, we can't guarantee that. But as we saw with the last slide about trends, if there's an increase in warning letters and enforcement actions, then we would also expect there to be an increase in class action lawsuits. That's our prediction. We'll wait to see if that bores out in the future. One other aspect that I wanted to highlight for the group is that this is Dr. Eric Lander. He has been appointed by President Biden as the head of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which President Biden has elevated that position to the cabinet for the first time. Dr. Lander is a mathematician, geneticist, and professor at MIT. He's also a co-founder of the Broad Institute, which had a significant work with the Human Genome Project and with CRISPR in particular. So it will be interesting to see sort of the trickle-down effect, if you will, of having this new position be in the cabinet and how that will impact law and regulation moving forward. And I'm going to turn it over to Ben.
Hey everyone, this is Ben Abel in our Charlottesville office, and just wanted to take a couple slides to talk a little bit piggybacking off of what Ginny just discussed in terms of litigation and labeling issues, to talk about some prospective upcoming questions that were hot button issues, or at least were being thought of and discussed under the Trump administration, that will continue to be thought of and discussed the Biden administration, and we're going to try and figure out where things are the same and where that changes. I think the first area that's going to continue to be of interest is meat alternatives, both plant-based meat alternatives, and then more out there, what's going to happen with cell cultured meat alternatives or cell cultured meat, given that it's meat. So as things stand now, states continue to pass labeling laws as they relate to meat. Typically, the legislature passes a law that says you can't call a burger unless it comes from husbanded livestock, and terms like hot dog and kielbasa and chorizo, and all the terms we typically associate with meat. State legislatures are passing laws that say you can't call it that unless it comes from traditional sources. And overwhelmingly then, they have been sued by a number of different actors. Upton's Naturals, a plant-based manufacturer, and the parent company for Tofurkey is another active one in this space, as well as places like the Good Food Institute and other public advocacy groups have been suing and seeking to enjoin those laws. And overwhelmingly, those laws have been enjoined or ruled on by courts in a way that takes a lot of the teeth out of the labeling laws. And so that's kind of been the trend we've seen. The most recent decision is in Oklahoma, however, which the court did not enjoin the law and said because the law allowed for the manufacturer to put on its label, use a term like burger or hot dog, what have you, because there was a way that it could say plant-based or something like that, vegan, that was fine and that was sufficient and wouldn't cause consumer confusion. And that law said that the vegan label, the plant-based disclaimer, had to be in the same print of as the product description itself, hot dog, hamburger, what have you. And so I think the court said as long as that's allowed to be there, that's fine. I think manufacturers, and what the manufacturer in that case argued was having it to be the same size is really big, and it uses up a lot of real estate on the label, and they wanted to do something smaller and declare it elsewhere. But the end result of that is it seems like, to the extent a trend is developing, it's that if a state's law just says you can't use a term like that, that's not sufficient, and the court's going to enjoin it because consumers are smart enough where they see the word hot dog and they also see the word vegan to know what that means. But if a law allows for a manufacturer to use those terms, provided it also provides some kind of plant-based or other disclaimer, that would be sufficient. I think there's a question where we see kind of a patchwork of regulation developing across the country, state by state, being enjoined, being not enjoined, that there becomes some increased pressure for a national standard. And so while we have not seen a massive drumbeat for a national standard as to plant-based or meat-based or meat alternative labeling, typically where we've seen this kind of regulatory patchwork, that's where we may see action in the future, because it just becomes really difficult for manufacturers and producers to figure out, if I'm selling in Oklahoma, what do I have to do versus if I'm selling in California or selling in Arkansas. So with that, we'll continue to watch, and I think that there's a good chance that either states will continue to pass these laws and they'll continue to be struck down, or there may be some kind of national standard. But the bigger kind of question is, what's going to happen with cell-cultured meat? And I think the first question is, who's going to regulate it? FDA and USDA have been working together on trying to answer that question, whether USDA would take inspection, because USDA already does inspection, and other parts of the process would be shunted off to FDA. There's nothing definitive on that answer. And that also was influenced, I think, to some degree by the Trump administration's continued dalliance with the idea of, well, maybe we just combine FDA and USDA together and have one regulatory entity. That does not seem, I mean, it seemed half-hearted from the start from the Trump administration, and there's nothing to suggest that the Biden administration is going to pick up that mantle. But assuming that those two entities do remain separate from each other, the question is who is going to regulate it, how are they going to regulate it, and then, of course, for manufacturers and producers, two regulators having a hand on the ball at the same time can create headaches. I think another question with cell culture is how much does this administration embrace that area? As Ginny discussed in the previous slide, science, for lack of a better term, has been elevated to a cabinet level position, and does that have any influence on how the administration wants to push as it comes to cell culture? Another question, I think, is will the administration target traditional livestock operations and meat packing operations, and maybe not a front-on, full-on assault, but as we've seen with private plaintiffs and with other government entities that have targeted the industry for their concerns, at least about things like pollution or runoff, things like we've seen a lot of targeted activity around animal welfare. And so even if this administration doesn't head on say, we don't want people eating as much meat, do they nip at the edges of it in a way that allows cell cultures to continue to make inroads? So that will be something that we'll continue to want to watch and look for, is even if it's not a full-on assault, if there's things like environmental standards that would have big impacts on the industries, how does that affect what cell culture looks like going forward? And the second I wanted to discuss is what happens with country of origin labeling claims. These continue to be a big topic. They continue to be something that plaintiffs, attorneys on the class action side continue to target. You saw one recently about whether Tecate is actually brewed in Mexico or not. And Made in America specifically kind of has a weird FDA defers to FTC. FTC has something of an opaque approach to what Made in America disclosure looks like. California has its own statute, which has a different standard. I think, we would expect what we've heard, everything from the Biden administration, is to take a more cosmopolitan, multinational approach, less of, at least in terms of rhetoric, the protectionist or America first that we heard under the Trump administration. And does that look at enforcement either from FTC or other organizations, or just influence that trickles down on whether there's less influence on American-made products or a country of origin, region of origin labeling claims? On the flip side, though, I was reading that President Biden just signed an executive order on Made in America, and was reading through it. There was nothing regarding labeling claims or anything like that. But the Made in America order was, I think, in the press, talked a lot about in terms of sourcing for products for COVID-19, the fight against the pandemic, fight against the virus, excuse me. But there's stuff in there about President Biden's commitment to Jones Act shipping. So they are taking a wide view of what Made in America means, and that is something that this president has talked about before. And so, despite what you may typically think of a Democratic administration, is this something that President Biden and his administration continue to press as being worthy of enforcement, are Made in America claims? The last thing I would mention is that there continues to be no beef or pork country of origin labeling. For those of you in the industry or have come to too many of these webinars, beef and pork country of origin was out under the Obama administration, for which Biden was a vice president, as a result of a World Trade Organization dispute about the labeling requirements that the U.S. had, and as a result, the U.S. just did away with them. Under the Trump administration, there was a lot of activity about trying to get beef and pork country of origin labeling back. Cattlemen's Association sued to have it, basically saying USDA had a legislative requirement to do it. That suit was thrown out. We saw suits in New Mexico federal court about beef country of origin labeling. So the question is, going forward, is there some regulation that comes forward with beef and pork cool that would be compliant with the WTO and would provide some standard there, or does the Biden administration just kind of follow what the Obama and then Trump administrations did in just not touching it, and there being no beef or cool beef or pork cool requirements? So that will be one to continue to watch. That I think affects a lot of the people on this call. But generally, it'll be interesting to see what happens with Made in America claims going forward. And with that, I think Trent, you are next to grab the baton and run the last leg here.
Yes, I am by no means the anchor though. It's just like one of those relay races where you put your slowest guy last. So that's what I'll do here. But one thing before I get into what I'm going to do, I just wanted to ask Ben and Jenny if you could give me one takeaway to leave with our audience. Maybe I'll start with you, Ben, real quick.
Yeah, I think one takeaway would be that we are still very early in the Biden administration, and there are a lot of things that suggest, in terms of both Made in America and cell culture, that could go one of two ways. That they've kind of staked out claims, positions that could go either way as to long term. So you'll want to watch and see as we move forward. Do they tend to, and not in terms of rhetoric, but in practice, have some one position on these that seems to take precedent? But it's kind of unclear.
Yeah, I would echo. Oh, sorry, Trent. I would echo what Ben said. It's going to be interesting to see how the new administration plays out, and especially in light of COVID-19 and some of the regulations that were relaxed during COVID-19. Regarding hand sanitizer and stuff like that, to see how that plays out in future class action labeling litigation, particularly when, there have been a lot of companies that have made sort of claims regarding efficacy about killing viruses and COVID-19 in particular. I think that that's going to be a hot area for potential class actions in the future.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. I am now going to talk about the new Supreme Court. And I'll tell you, I'm very excited to talk about it just because I used to do the sort of Supreme Court preview that we used to do here every year, and I stopped doing it several years ago. So it's good to sort of get back, getting into the weeds with what the court is doing these days. And one quick aside, I'll tell you that I actually went to college with Justice Amy Coney Barrett at Rhodes College. She was a year ahead of me, and I wish I had some great stories to tell you, but I didn't know her that well. But I can tell you that I did mock trial with her. We were on the mock trial team together, and curiously, she was not an attorney on the mock trial team, but a witness. So now I guess my claim to fame is that I did mock trial with a future Supreme Court justice. So what I'm going to talk about is what do we see happening with this new composition of the Supreme Court? Does it really matter to replace one justice? And I think the answer is going to be yes, it does, especially when you take what is widely viewed as a more liberal justice like Justice Ginsburg with a much more conservative justice like Justice Barrett. And what I wanted to talk about are a few things to watch for with this court. And like I said, it's very early, but even with just the couple months that we already have, there's a few takeaways. You can sort of see some trends that might inform what's going to happen in the future. And the first one that I wanted to mention is the court's so-called shadow docket. And that's essentially orders that the court hands down outside of the normal procedures. Typically, a request for emergency relief. It may be someone wants to stay an injunction that a lower court had, that kind of thing. And, that's normally not what we see. Usually there's this process where there's a cert petition, and it's granted, and there's briefing, and then there's oral argument, and then an opinion's handed down. But this is a much sort of more a quicker way of doing it, and it's something that's become increasingly common over the last couple of years and has accelerated even in just the last couple of months when we have the new composition of the court. And so the court's not afraid to use this shadow docket. Well, why does that matter? Well, the shadow docket is something where, like I said, the court moves a lot quicker. The opinions or orders that are handed down are much, they're shorter. So you don't really get the reasoning of the court, and you may not even know why the court ruled that it did. And so it's sort of a different way of doing things, but it's very effective in terms of taking some action that the court wants. If the court wants a particular thing to happen, they can do it this way without necessarily getting into the legal reasons and policies for doing it, which may have to be briefed and dealt with months or even years down the road. But if they're able to stay a particular policy from occurring, then from a practical standpoint, that's obviously very important to a lot of folks, including those in business. And let me give you one example of where we saw this recently. So there was recently, earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the Trump administration wanted the FDA to resume enforcing a requirement for in-office visits for abortion-inducing medication, despite the pandemic. And there was a district court ruling that blocked the FDA's request. So the FDA filed something with the U.S. Supreme Court asking that district court ruling to be stayed. And the Supreme Court agreed and said, yes, we're going to stay that district court ruling. And what's interesting is that the order that put this into effect was 105 words long. Justice Sotomayor wrote a very lengthy dissent decrying this, and hers was almost 3,000 words. So you can see where, if you only have 100 words on something, it's a sharp difference from what you would normally get from the court in the way that it adopts certain, policies with a normal case. So that's the first thing I guess I wanted to flag. Here's sort of an interrelated reason with that. These are cases, COVID-related religious restrictions, where a governor says, oh, we're going to not have church services or gatherings because of COVID. And there were a number of these. And you can see in this chart right here that pre-Justice Barrett's confirmation, those were upheld, but once she was confirmed, they were not upheld. So Justice Barrett was actually the deciding vote in some of these. And these came up largely through the shadow docket that I was talking about. And so that's one thing, I guess, one very practical, concrete example of how Justice Barrett being on the court has made a difference. But it also, I think, highlights another trend that we're seeing, and I think will continue to be an issue going forward, and that's the sort of the concept of religious liberty. That's a concept that really drives, at least 5 votes on the Supreme Court right now. And I think you're going to see more and more cert petitions or anytime you're trying to get the Supreme Court to act on something, it's going to be pitched as religious liberty. And that can manifest in lots of ways, but I think you're going to see maybe new ways to pitch things as infringing upon religious liberty. And everything we've seen from this new court thus far suggests that they're going to be very, very open to those kinds of arguments, and may very well strike down anything that has even the slightest infringement on religious liberty. So that's something I think that is important to look at and to watch for going forward. Something else that I think is interesting is, and this is not a new trend, that the whole idea of the class action mechanism being gradually chipped away. That's been occurring for some time, but I think with this court, that is going to accelerate. And of course, in the food and beverage industry, what I do is I do a lot of food and product labeling class actions. And I know that there's a disproportionate number of class actions against those in the food and beverage industry. And I think it's obviously very important to watch this, but I think we have to start preparing for a post-class action world, because I think that this Supreme Court, not right away, but over the next period of time, some period of years, is going to chip it away to where there's fewer and fewer class actions. And one example is a case that cert was just granted recently, and it's out of the Ninth Circuit, and it has to do with whether or not, basically damages class action, and what happens when the vast majority of the class suffered no actual injury. And that is something that the Supreme Court's going to take up. They haven't even had oral argument yet. But I just wanted to flag this particular one because it's going to be important to see if this sort of theory that I'm positing here is actually going to take place about sort of the gradual chipping away of the Supreme Court. And I'll be very curious to see what the court does with this. I suspect that it's probably going to be they're going to continue to chip away at the Supreme Court with this. One other thing I wanted to mention, and this is less with what the U.S. Supreme Court is doing right now, but this second case on here, Johnson v. Impasse, that is an 11th Circuit decision that came down back in the fall, and it essentially struck down the use of incentive or service awards for class reps in any class action. And that sort of was like a thunderbolt in those who do class action law because it came really out of nowhere. And since then, there's been an en banc petition that has been pending to potentially reverse it, but it's been sitting there for 2.5 months, so we're not real sure what's going on. The Sixth Circuit came down with a decision in the last week or two that disagreed with that 11th Circuit panel decision. But this is an example, I think, of what I mean by the post-class action world. There's going to be more and more attacks on certain sort of routine things that we see in class actions, and you're going to see more and more of the more conservative judges on these circuit courts listening to those kinds of arguments, and that's going to bubble up to the Supreme Court sooner rather than later. So that'll be interesting to watch as well. And really the last thing I wanted to mention real quick as we're running out of time is are we going to see a new Lochner area? And I know Lochner is sort of a loaded term, but this is the conversations that I know a lot of folks in Democratic and liberal circles are having right now. And what is this court going to do? And I think what I see happening is, I don't necessarily think the Supreme Court's going to stymie a legislative agenda just because I'm not sure there's going to be a whole lot of a legislative agenda based on what Ryan said and sort of the fact that you're going to need 60 votes to get anything passed through Congress. But what I do see is I do think this Supreme Court is going to continue to fight, that's why I have this picture on here, with the executive branch. Executive orders from the Biden administration, executive orders from governors. One of the things that we're always sort of looking at in the Supreme Court is if the justices give speeches, what are they saying? And there was a speech that Justice Alito gave back in November before the Federalist Society. And what he was talking about was he was really alarmed at governors and presidents grasping to wield power through appointed officials. He actually talked about these appointed experts, sitting in these government agencies, basically taking over the legislative authority. And he was very upset about that. And we've already seen on that last slide, or the slide about the COVID restrictions, how the court is dealing with that. But I think that's going to be an ongoing fight that we're going to see over and over and over again. And so that's something else to watch for. And then the last thing, real quick, is there is one food and beverage case on the docket of the current term, although it doesn't really deal with food and beverage issues per se. It's more of a statutory interpretation under the Alien Tort Statute Act. And there was oral argument in December, and we'll get a decision before 2 months longer. So with that, I think we are done for today. Thank you so much for your attendance. Really appreciate it. Always feel free to reach out to us if you have questions or just want to chat about this. So thanks for attending.